services, assistance, prevention, escape. Inside the enigma that is domestic violence. A very special In the Know with Phil Hayes starts right now. The proverbial elephant in the room, as they say, domestic violence. National organizations stipulate that 1 in 4 women will likely experience domestic violence at some point in their lives. Sadly yet, 1 in 3 will likely be murdered by a current or a former partner. Staggering statistics indeed. There are many organizations that are on the forefront against domestic violence. You're about to meet Tova Kasdan, a lifelong, tireless opponent of domestic violence who has gone all the way to Congress to discuss solutions and ideas on prevention. And In the Know spotlight on the MNADV, the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. Tova Kasdan. Get this. She wears a multitude of hats. She is the director of Elder Safe Center at the Charles E. Smith Life Community in Rockville, Maryland. That's here. You are the former prosecutor in Montgomery County, Maryland, specializing in domestic violence cases. You're involved with the Domestic Violence Consulting Group, and you are president of MNADV, which is Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. You wear a lot of hats.
Very busy. Yeah.
Yes. Welcome to In the Know. Thank you. Thank you for doing our show.
Thank you so much for having me today.
You're welcome. You're welcome. How long have you been involved in the campaign against domestic violence? How long have you been? What really got you started involved in this?
In college, I started to become interested in women's studies, and I majored as part of my interdisciplinary major in women's studies, and was very involved on campus on anti-violence campaigns against domestic abuse, sexual assault. And this was an issue that just very much resonated with me. I saw many young women who were being abused and really needed help. So I was interested in it both from an academic standpoint as well as a well-needed campaign in our community. So from there I went to law school, and with the intended goal of becoming a prosecutor to prosecute domestic violence cases, which is something that I've done in my career.
Now I mentioned earlier that I saw you on C-SPAN several years ago at a hearing on domestic violence. What are some of the more extreme cases, if I can ask, that you've seen or that you've litigated?
Sure. Sadly, there's many different types of domestic abuse cases, and some fall within the continuum of what we call high lethality cases. Within the Maryland Network Against Domestic Abuse, there's a lethality assessment project, which is a best practice model for, in fact, determining when cases are going to rise that high lethality case. When I was a prosecutor, one of many cases did in fact reach the high lethality level, and one of the cases in which I was heavily involved in was State of Maryland versus David Triggs. In that case, this abuser, he was sentenced to over 20 years in jail. He's currently out, but it was the first case of consecutively sentencing a domestic abuse offender who violated a protection order, so it was a groundbreaking case in Maryland.
But I know your familiarity is here with Maryland. Do they offer services to victims of abuse?
Every state has a domestic abuse coalition. In some states, our state is called the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. In other states, it might be called a coalition. So each state has a domestic abuse coalition and or a sexual assault coalition. In some states, those are combined. In our state, they're separate. And those are really important ways in which victims can reach out for resources as well as professionals to get additional help on domestic abuse cases. Additionally, every county in Maryland has a domestic abuse program which provides a comprehensive domestic abuse shelter and other victim services.
Okay. Tell us about MNADV. Tell us about the mission and the purpose of the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence.
Sure. I've been involved with the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence for many years. For the past 2 years, I've served as its president. It's really a wonderful way to bring together professionals from multidisciplinary aspects who work on this issue, whether they be prosecutors, victim services, allies, clergy. We work on many different issues involving domestic abuse to help victims get the help that they need to stay as safe as possible. And as I mentioned before, there are many great initiatives that the Maryland Network is involved in, including the Lethality Assessment Project, as well as some homicide prevention demonstration projects as well, where they partnered on national projects from around the country. So the network is well known and I hope is a real standard bearer for domestic violence services in our country.
Okay, I'm curious, and I'm just, with everything going on in social media today regarding the NFL and some things that are going on with some players there and celebrities, the general layman's, and again, I'm just playing devil's advocate here, the general layman's mindset is just, well, you know, if they're having such a, I mean, you and I both know that abuse extends well beyond physical. There's emotional, there's verbal, but primarily it's physical. There are people that would say, well, why don't they just leave if they're having such a hard time? But I know it's probably not that simple. What can you attest to with regards to the mindset of people that you have defended in you know, your past experience as an attorney? What's the mindset of why they choose to stay in, you know, in that type of relationship?
That's an excellent and frequently asked question, because we can say, as we look at this issue from the outside, is I would never allow myself to be treated that way. Why would I stay? That's a very common question. What we like to say is, why is this person abusing another person? This is a very complicated issue. For many women, and the majority of women are the ones who are abused, it's not so easy to just stand up one day and leave. There are many complicated dynamics within the relationship. For many women, the abuser threatens to abduct or use the children as a way to continue to coerce her to stay in the relationship. If he threatens her and says, you'll never see your children again, for many women, that's the one thing they care about, and so that is another way to anchor her. Domestic abuse is all about power and control, so there are many complicated ways in which an abuser uses that dynamic to keep the victim suppressed in the relationship. And it's been my, you know, real life's mission to do domestic abuse work, and no case is the same, but there are themes that emerge in working on domestic abuse cases. And one of them is, it is a complicated scenario. Many women may reach out several times for help and then do safety planning and may not be ready to leave for months, years, or even ever. So as a domestic abuse professional, what we try to do is support victims in the lives that they are in and try to make them as safe as possible. Some will choose to leave, some may not be able to leave now or ever, but if we can make it safer and always present the resources that are available, believe them, don't pass judgment, that's when women will know it's safe to reach out. I'm glad you brought up the NFL. That's really allowed us to start, I think, a very important national conversation on domestic abuse. This issue has always been there. It wasn't just one NFL player that sparked this. However, it's a real opportunity, and I do this with my own children as well, to start intergenerational conversation on domestic abuse. How do we want to be educating our children and parenting our children so that they know that it's never appropriate to physically, emotionally, financially, or sexually harm another person? It's only through these continued dialogues as a society that we're going to be able to move the needle on this issue. And what surprised me a lot about the Ray Rice case in particular is people seemed so surprised when they saw the entire video, so shocked. But we obviously knew what happened in the elevator. You know that because he dragged her out. And so it really surprised me that people actually needed that evidence. There's a lot of denial in our community on domestic abuse. People actually needed to see him physically hit her to say, wow, now I get it.
Right.
Unfortunately, not all domestic abuse is physical. There's so much that is emotional and kept behind closed doors. And we need to take this from a private issue to a public issue, to a time where we say it's unacceptable for any player to play at all in the NFL. It is unacceptable for any person to be employed in any workplace who commits these egregious acts. Until we as a society are willing to stand up, then these events will continue to go on.
That's a perfect segue into really my next question, which is a bit of a tangent on the one prior. Let's say that somebody comes in that door right now, and law enforcement's here, other services are here. They say, "I'm abused, I've been battered, please help me."
Right.
What's the process from start to finish? That person comes in the door, they say, "Please help me. I've been beaten, I've been hurt, I've been this, I've been that. I have nowhere to go, and I'm scared to leave." From A to Z, how does that whole thing do?
Sure. There are many different ways, and not every case moves through the civil and criminal justice systems in the same way. And for some folks, prosecution may not happen. So I can give you an example of a case. If someone comes in, like you said, and asks for help, here in Montgomery County, Maryland, we have what's called the Family Justice Center, which is a state-of-the-art model program where victims can receive holistic wraparound services without having to go from one building to the next throughout the county. So for example, in the example that you raised, if a victim wants help, she could apply for what's called a civil protective order, and that is an opportunity to go before a judge in the civil court and ask that the abuser stay away from her. It also can provide economic remedies so that she doesn't have to choose between, a life of abuse and not being able to afford to leave. If the case is ready for prosecution, in fact, the Family Justice Center houses the Family Violence Unit of the State's Attorney's Office, and there she would work with victim assistants who would help her prepare for what is court going to be like, which is a very traumatic and often stressful time for victims to have to confront their abusers. Because a lot of people don't realize this, that even with court protection, whether that be a civil protective order or court protection in the criminal setting, sometimes the violence actually escalates when a victim signals that she wants to leave. So she actually has to do a lot of safety planning with professionals like victim advocates to be able to prepare her, because at the end of the day, a protection order is important, but it is a piece of paper. And many women have been hurt or even killed following getting that. So it's a gentle balance between the victim knowing her case the best and then working with professionals who know how to help her get out of the situation if that's what she chooses to do.
What are some of the services that are available to victims that don't bear direct involvement with the state?
Sure. There's tremendous resources for domestic abuse victims around our country. The main place they can call for help is the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And that is a 24/7 number. Domestic violence professionals can help a victim from any state receive the assistance that she needs and link her to those services in her community. And as I mentioned before, within every state there's a domestic abuse coalition, so a victim could call that number and receive more localized services as well.
Mm-hmm. There may be someone watching this show right now who is an ideal candidate for everything that we've been talking about here today. They're scared, they don't know how to move, they don't know what to do, paralyzed by their fear, which is understandable given the consequences that you just mentioned earlier. What would you tell that person?
Right.
Yeah.
I would tell a victim who is being abused, first and foremost, you don't deserve this. That you will be believed and you will be helped. If you reach out for help, there are people who are there who are very kind, compassionate, and loving who will help you go from a life of abuse to a life that's hopefully free of abuse. It's not an easy process, and we know that, but by taking that first step and making that call, you will be able to receive that support, which is necessary. It's really hard to do this on your own, and sometimes it's even hard if you have supportive family and friends. It's important to work with professionals because these cases can be very dangerous, and we want to make sure that when a victim reaches out that she's doing so with the right advice and the right safety planning.
Right. Well, this has been very informative for me, and I hope very informative for all of our viewers. Tova Kasdan, President of the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all of the time that you've given us, and I hope that this reaches a lot of people, and I hope it does a lot of good. I really do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with more In the Know in just a moment. Every year, over 3 million children will witness domestic violence in their homes, an unconscionable number that exposes impressionable youth to be doomed to repeat the same vicious cycle. It's not enough to use catchphrases, slogans, and adages to assuage away our own responsibility in helping to rid society of this kind of behavior. Substantive action must be taken. With Tova Kasdan and the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence, among others, helping to take those actions, we can look forward to a day, perhaps sooner than later, when domestic violence itself will be beaten. I'm Phil Hayes, and you're in the know. We'll see you next time.